confuse the cameraman here. So I'm happy for this to be a very interactive section if you want. So if you have questions, comments, objections, complaints, just speak up anytime, and we'll have as much interaction as you want to have. And so I'll run through the material. Well, I might not get through all the slides, or if I do get through them, I may come back to some and talk about them in more detail. So, along the lines of my assigned topic, I'm going to talk about economics. How many of you are economists? 2, 3, 4.
Aren't we all in some regard?
Okay, so how many people have a degree in economics?
Better question.
So how many people are students of economics right now? Okay. And so how many people haven't studied any economics but you're just kind of interested or didn't have anything else to do? I just want to get familiar with who we have here. So the title of the program is the title that Brian gave me, What's Wrong with Economics? I don't know that anything is really wrong with economics. So I changed that a little, what's missing in economics? And so let me give a little background on that, because if you've taken some economics, you know economists tend to work by developing models. So developers like supply and demand, sort of thing. And so we develop these models, and to design the models, we make assumptions. We make a couple kinds of simplifying assumptions in our models. First of all, we'll assume some things away. So just in the last presentation we saw in the organ markets, the supply and demand for organs and so forth. Probably there's a lot of other things that are going to affect organ donors, but what we're thinking when we put the model up is really the price is the key thing. So we're assuming a lot of other things away. And then sometimes we make unrealistic assumptions. And those unrealistic assumptions aren't necessarily bad. What they do is they help us to focus on things, on the things that we really think are important. So, for example, this might resonate more with some of you than others, but if we put price control to hold prices down, then what that's going to do is it means that demanders are going to demand more and suppliers are going to supply less, and we have a shortage. And a lot of times we'll depict that in a competitive market. And so our market's really perfectly competitive, maybe, maybe not, but it's really not important for the point that we want to understand in the model, right? Because the real world is a complicated place. That's why we need the model, right? If we could just look out the window and say, I understand how the economy's working, then we wouldn't need the model. So we make simplifying assumptions. The idea is if we understand the relationships in the model, then hopefully that transfers to the real world so we understand what's going on in the real world. And think, for example, about a map. A map is a model. It's not like a model, it is a model. It's a geographic model. So you look at a road map, and a lot of things are assumed away. Right? So you're driving down the road, and you see, oh, there's a television tower, broadcast tower. That's not on the map. It doesn't matter for where you go. So we assume those away. And also on a road map, you'll find that the roads are typically larger, drawn larger than to scale. That's unrealistic, but it helps us to understand where we're going. So the same thing with assumptions in economics. We make assumptions to have simple models. And the simpler the better, as long as it's not too simple, right? And the idea is the real world is pretty complicated, but if we understand the relationships in the simple model, we understand more about what's going on in the real world. But because we make those assumptions in our models, no model can really explain everything to us. Because we're assuming some things away. And the model can't explain things that are assumed away. And sometimes we'll use models where we'll assume away things that might be crucial to what we're trying to understand. So you know, what's missing in mainstream economics? Are we too often assuming away some critical things that we really need to understand? We're assuming away some of the key parts of the issues that we're trying to understand. And in case this gets too boring and it will put too many people to sleep, ultimately I'm going to say we're assuming away a lot of institutional detail that's really important for us to understand a lot of problems that we're trying to deal with. So that's just by way of a little bit of introduction. Now, some of you said that you're economists. You're studying economics or you have a degree in economics. So, what is economics? Can you give me a definition? Anybody want to give me a definition of economics?
Production, supply, and distribution of goods and services.
Okay, production, supply, and
Distribution of goods and services.
Oh, okay. That's good.
Effective management of resources.
Effective management of resources. Yeah. I'm not necessarily going to say there's a correct definition of economics, but I want to give you a few definitions of economics. A couple of them that I just picked from prominent sources. This is Lionel Robbins. This is a pretty famous definition of economics. It's a science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. Does that mean anything? I mean, when I started studying economics, that was a definition I think I ran across or something like that in my introductory textbook. So the idea is that there are lots of ends that people want to achieve, but there's a limited amount of resources. And so this definition says we've studied human behavior as a relationship between all those ends that we're trying to accomplish and the scarce means to accomplish them. So that definition is probably as common a one as you'll find in textbook. This next definition actually is in Paul Samuelson's introductory textbook. And Samuelson, I always find Samuelson to be excessively confusing in his writing. And this definition, I think it's the same definition as Robbins' definition, but more confusing. Economics is the study of how men in society end up choosing, with or without the use of money, to employ scarce productive resources that could have alternative uses to produce various commodities, distribute them for consumption now or in the future, among various people and groups in society, and analyzes the costs and benefits of improving the patterns of resource allocation. So these are common definitions of economics, and the focus there, and there's I could put up more definitions. My colleague Jim Gordon has an introductory textbook where he says something, his definition is something like economic, and it's right along the lines of these, economics is how people choose. And so the focus there on both of these definitions and many others is choice. And I think the same thing maybe with your definitions, like we have a lot of alternative scarce, we have scarce resources, we have a lot of alternative uses, and we want to make a choice. And so I'll throw in my own definition. It's my talk, so I get to have a definition. So I'm going to say economics is the study of ways that people interact to improve their material well-being. So that's my definition. And so what's the difference here between my definition and Robbins' definition or Samuelson's definition? Well, in my definition, economics is a study of ways that people interact and improve material well-being. I'm really not looking at the choice. I'm looking at exchange, at markets. So just as we think about economics, what are we studying? Are we studying choice, scarce resources, lots of ends? How do we choose? or are we studying exchange, the way that people interact to improve their material well-being? So I'm not really saying one definition is more right than another, but the focus is on different things. The way I'm looking at it in economics, what we focus on, markets and other social institutions that enable people to interact to improve their material well-being. So not so much a matter of how people choose, what ends we pick, what choices that we make, but rather we all have our own various ends that we're trying to accomplish, and we can interact with other people. You know, how do we interact with other people in order to mutually cooperate to achieve those ends? So my own preference is to focus on the exchange rather than choice. Although, you know, so I'm not saying, well, that's the right thing, and economists who are focusing on choice, they're paddling up the wrong river or something like that. But I do have some more things to say, kind of somewhat critical of that approach. And I think, you know, if we're really interested in the well-being of people, that the really productive way for economics to move is to look at the institutions that help people interact, to engage in exchange, to improve their mutual well-being. Now, the title of my talk actually evolved a little bit as I started to do this. I think originally, Brian, you said you wanted me to talk about philosophy, politics, and economics. And indeed, these disciplines are related. I'm going to focus a lot on the development of institutions, because back from my current title, what's missing, I think institutions are missing, and a key part of that is political philosophy. Philosophy and politics work together to give us some idea about the institutional foundation that we want to have to develop productive institutions. And again, I think a key thing here that we tend to overlook is institutions. But in thinking about this idea of the philosophy, politics, and economics, let me go back to an idea of an early philosopher, John Locke. His two treatises of government, 1690, this is probably the most cited passage out of Locke's two treatises of government. Every man has a property of his own person, so that's a pretty liberty-minded thing. So I guess we have pretty much libertarian crowd here, so we start out with this liberty-minded idea. Every man has a property of his own person. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. And so you have a property right in yourself. You own yourself. We start with that idea of self-ownership. Because you own yourself, you own your labor. The work of his hands, we may say, are property his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state of nature, that the state of nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his own labor with and joined with something that is own, and thereby makes it his property. Okay, so Locke's idea, you own yourself, and therefore you own your labor. And so when you combine your labor with unowned resources, you combine something that's unowned with something you own, then you come to own that property. Right? And for this labor being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to. And so Locke here, a political philosopher, lays out a moral foundation for private property and for a market economy. Right? I mean, maybe we might want to think, well, maybe Marx had some good ideas. Maybe we should own things in common. Maybe the means of production shouldn't be privately owned. And so, well, here's a moral philosopher who offers a moral justification for private property and for a market economy. You own yourself, therefore you own your labor, therefore you own what you produce with your labor. It's a moral justification for property rights. And we see in Adam Smith. He was a professor of moral philosophy. Economics grew out of moral philosophy. So Adam Smith was a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow. His two books, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations. And so The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published earlier. So Smith was a philosopher first, professor of moral philosophy, then wrote The Wealth of Nations, the father of economics, writing The Wealth of Nations. Let me just step back and make a distinction here. So Smith, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is a book in moral philosophy. And let me make a distinction between moral philosophy and political philosophy. That moral philosophy, the idea there is that moral philosophy guides us as to what's the right thing to do in certain circumstances. Political philosophy tells us what should our rights and obligations be relative to other people. And so let me give you an example just to think about that. Think about the distinction between moral philosophy and political philosophy. Let's say you're standing on a dock. And as you're standing there with other people on the dock, and somebody falls into the water and is thrashing about, "Help, I can't swim, help, help." And there's a life preserver there on the dock. Should you throw the life preserver to the person who can't swim? So, moral philosophy looks at the question, what should you do in certain circumstances? And probably most people would think, yeah, you should pick up the life preserver and throw it to the person who's there in the water. Political philosophy looks at what our rights and obligations are relative to other people. So, should you have a legal obligation to throw the life preserver? Should you be required to throw the life preserver? Now we might have different answers to that question, but one way to look at it is you didn't have anything to do with the person falling in the water. It's not your responsibility to take care of other people, so too bad that person fell in the water, but you don't have a legal responsibility to take care of other people because of their carelessness. So, now, and we might debate that even with political philosophy. Some people might have a different idea on that. But I make that example to show the difference between moral philosophy and political philosophy. I think most people would say, yes, you have a moral obligation to do it. I mean, what, you just pick up the life preserver and throw it in. And Adam Smith, in his Theory of Moral Sentiments, had this device of the impartial spectator, which is basically just what most people in society would think was the right thing to do. And so the impartial spectator would stand there over you and say, of course you should throw the life preserver. I mean, what, it's going to cost you so little to do it, and you can save some person's life. But maybe if we look at it from the from the standpoint of political philosophy, it's not so clear in that case, right? Where should you be responsible for the accidents of other people? And of course, we could make it. I don't want to get into philosophical questions too much, but I don't know. Maybe should you jump in to help if there's no life preserver? Should you jump in and help the person? Of course, then you would be putting yourself at risk. But the point is that moral philosophy, what should you do in certain circumstances? Political philosophy, what are your rights and obligations relative to other people? It's really the political philosophy that's more relevant to the development of economics. Let's see, I think let's look at what Adam Smith had to say about institutions and prosperity, because Smith was taking an institutional approach to economics. He's looking at, if we go back to thinking about economics, he's looking at the way people interact to improve their well-being. Just a few famous passages from The Wealth of Nations. This last passage is actually from a talk that Smith gave elsewhere. But a couple of famous passages. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. People get together, they exchange for their mutual benefit. And here, we see the focus of Smith on exchange. It's not choice, it's exchange, right? So we take for granted the butcher, the baker, the brewer, they want to earn some income from their profession. And we apparently, want our dinner, and so we're willing to engage in an exchange, and so we have mutually beneficial exchange. And so we're focusing not really on choice, the way some definitions focus, but we're focusing on the idea of exchange. And then another excerpt, if we know anything about the Wealth of Nations, it's probably that concept of the invisible hand. And this is an excerpt. I teach a class in history of economic thought, and so we can spend a whole hour talking about this particular passage, but I'm not going to. By directing that industry, this is with the passage where the invisible hand, by directing that industry in such a manner as the produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and it is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. So there again, we're looking at the process of exchange and the way people looking out for their own interests, they engage in economic activity which they're led by an invisible hand. And one just real interesting thing maybe to note about that passage is Smith doesn't present it as an analogy. It's not that somebody is led as if by an invisible hand. He says there's an invisible hand. There's this in many other cases, led by an invisible hand. So I don't know how much focus we should put on like one little word in a big book, but nevertheless, he's not presenting it as an analogy. He's saying there's an invisible hand. Now focusing on institutions, Smith says, little else is requisite to carry a state to its highest degree of opulence, from the lowest barbarism, the peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. All the rest being brought about by the natural course of things. So, as we look at this, Smith is telling us, here are some institutions that lead us to prosperity, and the natural course of things, well, I guess that's the invisible hand. And again, Smith, if we're thinking about, what are we studying in economics? Is it choice? Is it exchange? And here we see the focus of Smith on exchange. The division of labor, from which so many advantages are derived, is not originally the effect of any human wisdom, which foresees and intends the general opulence to which it gives occasion. This is the necessary, though very slow and gradual, consequence of a certain propensity in human nature, which has in view no such extensive utility, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. So again, Smith's focus on exchange, on the institutions within which people interact, which leads to prosperity. if we look at the development of economic analysis, if you go back to the 18th century when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776. And at that time, there were some competing schools of thought as Smith came along. There were the mercantilists who thought that wealth is created by accumulating gold and silver. The more gold and silver, the more money you had, the wealthier that you are. And in France, there was a school now called the Physiocrats. They argued wealth comes from the land. They were somewhat taking issue with the mercantilists. They were saying it's really wealth. It's not how much money you have. It's what you can buy and consume with the money. That's what's wealth. And Smith, in his book, The Wealth of Nations, the full title is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. He doesn't leave the reader in suspense. In the very first sentence of the book, he says, the wealth of nations is the result of the division of labor. Specialization, division of labor causes the wealth of nations. So you go back to the 18th century, and the focus of economics was on how wealth is created. There are a number of different ideas. The mercantilists, wealthiest, we have more money. The physiocrats, it's what you can consume and produce. They thought wealth came from the land. They weren't really big on manufacturing, more on agriculture. And Adam Smith, the wealth comes from the division of labor. But the focus of economics was on how wealth is created. You know, the mercantilists accumulate gold and silver. The physiocrats, wealth comes from the land, how much you can consume. And Adam Smith, he gives the title of his book, The Wealth of Nations, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. How is wealth created? That was the focus of economics in the 18th century. We move to the 19th century, that focus gets lost a little bit, and it's partly because of the work of Thomas Robert Malthus and David Ricardo, both who had very pessimistic views of our economic future, that population growth is going to outstrip the availability of resources. Most people are always going to be stuck at a subsistence level of income. So you may have heard of economics sometimes called the dismal science. And you say, oh yeah, I took economics, I know how to. But really, it's, in this era, from the idea that most people are going to be stuck in poverty. So that issue of wealth sort of faded to the background, and other issues more came to the front in political economy. One of the big issues was the distribution of income. And then, as we move into the 20th century, we get a different focus in economics, where economics is focusing on the properties of economic equilibrium. What are the properties of equilibrium? And we go back, again, we might go back as far as Leon Walras, who published his Elements of Pure Economics in 1874. However, his ideas didn't really catch on until the mid-20th century. So Alfred Marshall had a big impact. His Principles of Economics in 1890. He had the supply and demand idea there. And from Marshall, economics increasingly developed to analyze properties of economic equilibrium. So I've got just a couple graphs here for equilibrium concepts. You may be familiar with the supply and demand, quantity supply equals the quantity demand in here. So we have equilibrium, price, and quantity. And here's a general equilibrium, a diagrammatic exposition of general equilibrium. And as we move to looking at these concepts of equilibrium, institutions fade to the background. So we don't really see institutions here. We have demanders. Here's a demand schedule that tells us how much the quantity that people will demand at different prices. And our supply schedule tells us how much suppliers are willing to supply at different prices, and so we get an equilibrium price and quantity. And if we look at what's behind all of this, demanders have utility functions that determine how they choose. So there's this idea of choice. Demanders have utility functions, and suppliers have production functions. And in this equilibrium framework, and for those of you who are economists or economics students, you back me up or argue with me on this, but basically we have consumers have utility functions from which we derive demand functions, and suppliers have production functions from which we derive supply functions. And so starting with the utility functions and the production functions, we combine them and we get general economic equilibrium. Is that like approximately right? Yeah. And there are no institutions. When we're looking at these ideas, and there are no institutions behind what we're doing. We have utility functions, production functions, put them together, supply and demand, and we get to equilibrium. But how much people are willing to supply and how much people are willing to demand rests in a very large part on the institutions within which people supply and demand. So even in a most rudimentary exchange, let's say, I could do this, I don't know if you could do this in Singapore, like you're driving down the street and here's some guy who's selling watermelons out of the back of his truck. And so you pull off and you bargain, you negotiate for a price, and you pay for the watermelon, and you take off. Not too many institutions that lie behind that transaction, but first of all, you need money. Otherwise, you'd have to barter for the watermelon. It would be a lot more complicated. And also, in some way or another, there has to be some protection of property rights. Maybe it's just that the guy who has the watermelons in his truck looks like a big, strong guy, and so you're not going to try to steal his watermelons. Or maybe there's some police protection thinking, if I steal the watermelons, he's going to call the police and I'll get in trouble or something like that. But my point is that even in a simple exchange like that, there are institutions that lie behind the exchange. And if we're thinking about more complex transactions, let's say you decide you want to build a shopping center. Now you really need a lot of institutions in order to be able to build that shopping center. Because first of all, you're going to need some land for the shopping center. And so if you want to buy the land, and so somebody says, well, I have some land here, so I'll sell you this land. How do you know that's that person's land? So you have to have some way to register the title. In the United States, it's done by county, so every county courthouse, there's a land registry. And you go to the county courthouse, and you can see in the courthouse, there's the record that says who owns the land. And in another complication, somebody might put a lien on that land. Like, for example, if somebody comes in and does some work on the land or paints a house or something and you don't pay them, then they can put a lien on the property, and the lien goes along with the property. And so if you don't have clear title, you'd have to pay off the lien to get clear title for the property. But you need some land registry in order to take care of that. And then you need money to build the shopping center. Where are you going to get the money? Unless you're really rich, you probably have to go to the bank and borrow the money. So why, but they're not just going to give you the money without any assurance that you're actually going to build the shopping center. They want to use the shopping center as collateral, right? So if you don't pay off your loan, then you lose your property. Even another institution, I mean, what if it turns out later on, like you build your shopping center, and so later on somebody comes along and says, hey, that was my property that you built that shopping center on. So you get title insurance. When you get the loan, not only do you buy the land, you also have to pay for title insurance. So if it ever turns out later there's a problem with the title, then the title insurance will take care of the problem. I mean, these are all institutions that you need to build that shopping center. And then the bank, they're not going to just give you the money, but they'll give it out in stages. So you get this far in construction, we'll give you this much, and then you proceed a little further, we'll give you more, and then a little further. So there are all of these institutions, financial institutions, legal institutions, that stand behind transactions like that. And so if you look at supply and demand, we're leaving out that institutional background. And I might mention the work of Hernando de Soto, he's not the old dead explorer. This is a currently living Peruvian economist. Has written a couple of nice books. One of them is The Other Path. De Soto is a Peruvian economist, and he's looking at the question, why is it that some countries like Peru are so much poorer than other countries like the United States? And De Soto's answer is, a lot of that has to do with institutions. That if we're thinking about what's missing in contemporary economics, a lot of what's missing in contemporary economics is the role that institutions play in supply and demand. Right? So, and De Soto has a lot of good examples in his book about the Peruvian economy. And one of them, very closely related to the example that I just gave, a lot of times titles to land in Peru isn't exactly clear. So it's not really clear who owns the land. It's a vacant piece of land, and you might say, oh, I want to build a house, and so you build the house on that land. But it's not entirely clear, there's not a title registry that you can go to, it's not entirely clear that you own the land, even though you built the house. And so what's the problem with that? Well, I mean, one problem is you're probably not going to be able to get a loan to build the house because you can't guarantee to the lender that you actually own the land that the house is being built on. Right? So you have to. So you're not going to be able to. What you can build on is limited by the resources that you currently have available. You're not going to be able to build a very nice house unless you already have a lot of money, because you're not going to be able to borrow money. And another problem is, if it's not really clear that you have title to the land, you might not be able to sell the house. Right? So you say, well, I think I'll move, I'll sell my house. Easy to do in the United States, difficult to do in Peru because it's not really clear who owns the land. So when we go back and we think about supply and demand, so here's the supply of housing and here's the demand for housing. Well, wait a minute, where are those curves sitting? The demand curve, the supply curve, it depends on institutions, right? And without the institutions to support that market, you're going to find, demanders aren't going to be so willing to buy, suppliers aren't going to be so willing to supply. So we just draw those curves up in our models, and there has to be some institutions behind this. Right? There has to be some institutions behind this. If nothing else, we're assuming that goods are exchanged through voluntary trade. So there has to be some institutions protecting property rights. Otherwise, you just go ahead and steal everything. And, why buy stuff when you can just go ahead and steal it? So, I mean, even in the simplest model, the simplest market, there has to be institutions that determine where that supply curve is, where that demand curve is. And as we get into more and more complex markets, we need more and more complex institutions to support the exchange. So De Soto is saying, in Peru, that we don't have that institutional framework that allows economies to work the way they do in an advanced economy. I saw somebody giving a talk on this one time. So maybe I should have made a little slide the same way. But he was giving a talk on institutions, and it was kind of funny because he put up a slide, and there was a picture of a cow on one side, And then there was the exact same picture of the cow on the other side. And he said, well, what's the difference between these two cows? And he was talking about institutions in developed versus less developed economies. And he'd say, in a developed economy, you can use your cattle as collateral to take out a loan. So you borrow money to feed the cows and take care of them. Then when you sell your cattle, you pay back the loan. But in less developed economies, they don't have those kind of markets, so you can't use the cattle as collateral. So what's the difference between the two cows? One of them is collateral that enables the cattle farmer to get money in advance. The other one, no, you can't do it. So these institutions are really important to the operation of society. And so let me talk about a couple of examples. First of all, limited liability corporations. Advanced economies wouldn't be nearly so advanced, and you wouldn't be able to grow, companies wouldn't be able to grow nearly as fast as they do if it wasn't for the limited liability corporation. What the limited liability means, investors are only liable up to the amount that they have invested in the company. So if it were not for limited liability, owners of companies would be liable for all of their company's debt. And because of limited liability, it makes it a lot more feasible for entrepreneurs to borrow from a lot of different people. I'll tell you myself, if I ever get a little extra money or something, what I like to do is to gamble it away in the stock market. Now, fortunately for me, stocks tend to go up, so that's actually worked out pretty well for me. And I tend to buy individual stocks just because I just enjoy just trying to pick stocks. And I'll just, as a little aside, but I won't go into more detail, I think I can do about as well as anybody, and it's because of the efficient markets hypothesis. But if you don't know what that is, I'm not going to explain it right now. Anyways, so I personally, I own stock in about 40 different companies. And if one of those companies goes bankrupt, I'm going to lose my money that I have invested in that company, but no more because of the limited liability corporation. Whereas if it weren't for limited liability, the owners of the corporation would be liable for all of the company's debts. Which wouldn't make any sense for me to invest in 40 companies that I don't really have much exercise of control over, don't know what's going on, day-to-day operations of the companies. And so limited liability has enabled companies to grow a lot faster and a lot bigger than they would be without that limited liability. Okay? So I mean that's one example of the way that institutions matter. Another institution, intellectual property. We've heard a little bit about that earlier today. You know, what keeps somebody from stealing your idea, from profiting from your idea? It's intellectual property rights. But it's interesting when you I mean, why should there be any property rights over intellectual property? If we think about in the sense of Locke, property rights, that if I take your property, I'm depriving you of the use of your property, right? So let's say that I take your guitar. So you can't play your guitar anymore. But let's say you write a song, and then I sing your song on my play my guitar. You can still use it. I'm not taking anything from you, right? Computer programs, it's the same way. I mean, let's say I run off with this computer. I don't even know whose it is. Or run off, then they can't use the computer. But with the software, I can make a copy and put it on my computer. I'm not taking it from once the program's written for one person, everybody can use it. So I'm not taking anything away from anybody. Right? Now I might be taking away the value, right? Okay, so now you can't profit from your program because everybody's just copying it. But normally when we think about property rights, you have a right to the use of your property, but not the value of your property. So if you buy a house, and then like in 2008 in the United States, the housing market goes down, you don't have a right to the value of the house, you have a right to the use of the house. So it's still your house. Now it's just worth half as much as it used to be. But you don't have a right to the value, you just have a right to the use of the property. So, I don't know, should we have intellectual property rights? And I'll just tell you, in U.S. law, if you write a computer program, you can copyright it, and you have intellectual property rights, the government will back up. If you're a fashion designer, you design a new line of clothing, in the U.S. law, you can't copyright or patent your fashion designs. As soon as your ultra skinny fashion model walks out in the new fashions, anybody can just copy it and make knockoffs right away. In the U.S., if you design a new drug, patent the formula for that drug, you get the property rights, so other people aren't allowed to copy your drug. But if you design a new culinary recipe, like you run a restaurant, you come up with a new recipe. In the United States, recipes for food can't be patented or copyrighted. Anybody can just go ahead and copy your recipe. They eat at your restaurant, oh, that's pretty good, I'm going to make that at home. You might have to figure out how to do it, but nevertheless, you can't. So it's interesting. I mean, so, you know, medical drugs, software, music, books, there's intellectual property rights that protect those. Fashion designs, recipes, no intellectual property protection for those. Can't be patented or copyrighted, at least in the United States. Why?
Boils down to a lot about the market that the country wants to grow. The kind of market that the country wants to grow.
Yeah, but I mean, it seems like it's kind of arbitrary, though. I mean, so why if I make a new fashion design, I don't have any intellectual property rights to it. But if I write a computer program, so I'm just suggesting, well, first of all, those intellectual property rights make a difference to the way the economy works. And it seems like maybe there's some arbitrariness. I mean, where do we draw the line? So institutions are somewhat arbitrary in that sense. So
if we can have a bit of Q&A, that will be good.
okay, yeah.
Maybe a few moments to finish off and summarize.
Okay, yeah, I'm willing to take Q&A at any time. If you want, I can rush through my other slides, or we can just take Q&A at this point. Here, I had this up in an earlier talk. You know, what type of institutions do we need to have a prosperous society? Property rights, rule of law, so forth. Those are some institutions. I have a couple of slides. I'll just breeze by these on the new institutional economics. That in fact, economists are more and more recognizing the importance of institutions in economics. And another slide that I think I'll just skip over, talking about constitutional economics. This is by Professor James Buchanan, who's pioneered this idea of constitutional economics. Something's probably worth talking about a little bit. And I'm going to put up this next slide, because Brian asked me something about it over email before, about behavioral economics, because here, behavioral economics is more looking at the way that people make choices. As we look at those definitions at the outset, how do people choose? And what choices do they make? And behavioral economics looks at whether people are making rational choices. Any of you familiar with the idea of behavioral economics? So a couple of people, but I'll just give you one conclusion from behavioral economics. that suggests that maybe in the economics lingo, people don't make quote, rational choices, but framing effects might matter. So if I give you a choice of two things, the way I frame the choice might determine what you choose. And here's a real world example from that. In the United States, people were thinking, well, the companies would have pension plans. So you get hired, and they say, if you want to, you can join the company pension plan. And here are the benefits from the plan and so forth. Do you want to sign up? And people are thinking, more people should sign up than are actually signing up. So they framed it differently. So the way it was framed is, here's the pension plan, do you want to sign up for the pension plan? Another way to frame it is to say, you're one of our new hires, we have this pension plan, you're automatically enrolled in the pension plan, but if you want, you can opt out. And that second way, a lot more people stay in the pension plan. So it's interesting because it's the same choice, right? Either way, it's do you want to be in the pension plan or not? But if it's pitched to you, here's an optional pension plan that we have, do you want to opt in? Fewer people say yes than if we say you're automatically enrolled in the pension plan, but if you want to, you can opt out. So it's kind of one example of behavioral economics. And one thing I will just point out before I absolutely quit and turn things over to questions is in that equilibrium approach to economics, we go back and think about that general equilibrium framework. We have to make a lot of assumptions about individual utility functions and production functions in order to arrive at a theoretical equilibrium. So if I'm proving, like in a Nobel laureate deserving proof, the uniqueness and stability of competitive equilibrium, which did win a couple of Nobel Prizes, DeVoe and Arrow and so forth, I have to make a lot of assumptions about the nature of production functions and utility functions for there actually to be a unique, stable, general equilibrium. But if we take a more institutional approach, along the lines of the definition of economics that I gave you to begin with, all you really need to assume is people are choosing what they think is their best option. You don't need to make, this is for economists, you don't need to assume that preferences are transitive and diminishing marginal rates of substitution and all that. We don't need those assumptions if we take an institutional approach. We just need to assume people are choosing what they think is best for them. How do they interact in order to improve what they perceive to be their own well-being? So I was kind of watching the clock here. It seems like we have about 8 minutes left. Questions, comments, who has something to say?
My question on the last point, because like recently I've been reading up on like this also, then I'm just wondering the emotional aspect and the moral aspect. Let's say I know a lot of information, emotional information about you, and because framing matters, right? So if I use your emotional, let's say, vulnerabilities against you, then am I being moral? And I charge you a higher price?
See, now there's a question for moral philosophy.
Yeah.
And my conjecture would be that I'd say, no, you're really taking advantage of me and you're not being moral. However, if it's a question of political philosophy, then the question is not, what's the right thing I should do and am I being moral? For political philosophy, the question would be, should you be prevented from doing that?
No, you shouldn't.
And so my answer to that would be, no, you shouldn't be prevented from doing that. It's up to me, the customer, to gain enough information to make sure that I'm getting what I want from you, the seller. And yes, you, the seller, you know a lot more than I do, and so you may have an informational advantage, but it's up to me, the customer, to decide. So let's say we decided otherwise. We said, no, you should be prevented from taking advantage of me. How would you do that? Well, one way you might do it is through government regulation. And one thing we know about government regulation is it tends to favor the people who are regulated. So ideally, you might think, oh, here would be the best way to regulate. But if you look at the actual political process that produces regulation, it's this concentrated special interests who are most involved in designing regulation for their benefit. And so it's likely that you're not going to get a very good regulatory outcome anyway. See? So we don't want, this goes back to what my talk yesterday, you don't want to compare real world problems of markets with some theoretical optimum, because you probably can't get to that theoretical optimum anyway. So that's kind of a long, involved answer, but the question you asked was a question of moral philosophy. Should you be able to take advantage? No, you shouldn't do that. But if we look at it from the standpoint of political philosophy, it's very problematic to try to design something to prevent you from taking advantage of me. And in a free society, it's up to me to protect my own interests. And if I'm not sure that you might be taking advantage of me, then I shouldn't be transacting with you. And so firms go to great lengths to build up their reputations for being fair and for giving good value to customers, because that's how they get repeat customers. So you might be able to take advantage of me a little bit, but once I discover it and I tell my friends, you know, they're not going to come by if things get publicized, it's really not to your advantage to take advantage of your customers either. So yeah, I think you should be allowed to do it as long as it's a voluntary transaction. Even though it might not be ethical to do it, moral to do it, but in the long run, it's going to work against the person who's trying to take advantage.
Yeah, question. So the market is extremely complex, and could you comment on the potential that even the best intended regulation, because of our imperfect knowledge and understanding of the functions of the market and the human brain and our social interactions, even the best intentioned regulation will create unintended consequences which we could have never predicted. Can you please expand on that? I mean, it's very interesting for people to understand that we're not all powerful, omnipresent, omnipotent beings, and even the best intention, which we'll never reach regulation, will always lead to negative unintended consequences.
Yeah.
We don't know.
So you said that so well, I don't know if I could say it better, but let me expand on it anyway.
Good.
First of all, there's a question of information. Do we have enough information to design a regulation that's not going to have unintended consequences? But then second of all, there's the problem of incentives. And a lot of times, and I know this is so true of regulation in the US, probably true of regulation everywhere else, that regulations are designed so they're not complete answers to the regulatory question. They leave a lot of discretion to the people who are enforcing the regulations, to the people who are interpreting the regulations. And what happens is this ends up leading to political favoritism. So that somebody who's on the good side of the regulator, well, we just will overlook this, or, you know, is this a violation of the rule? Well, it might be a violation of the rule if you're a bad guy, but if you're a good guy, then no, what you did is okay. And so when you look at the way regulations are interpreted and the way regulations are enforced, it leads to cronyism, it leads to corruption. And I'll just give you an anecdote. This is from my own experience. Some years ago, I put an addition on to the back of my house. I added a couple of rooms to my house. So I hired a contractor, and he had to get a building permit, so he got a building permit. And so in the process of construction, one day I'm there, but my contractor isn't. And the building inspector shows up, and he's looking at the way the roof is being built, and he says, that's not being built according to code. So the contractor's going to have to redo the roof. So anyway, my contractor shows up a while later, and I tell him the building inspector came, and he said that the roof is not being installed according to code. And my contractor says, no, it's fine, it's according to code. He's mistaken, don't worry, I'll take care of it. And so he goes and talks to the building inspector, and everything's okay. Was it according to code or not? I don't know. But what I know is my contractor knew the building inspector, and when the building inspector told me the roof wasn't up to code, then my contractor talked to me, oh, no, it's okay. So I mean, it's just an example of the vagueness of regulations, you're thinking, well, this is probably a really specific regulation. Then when you start getting into financial regulation, all these details, it leads to cronyism, it leads to corruption, and a lot of times people, you know, if you have a libertarian outlook on things, if you don't like big government, and I'm not really a fan of big government either, but it's not really the welfare state, it's not the transfers that are really pernicious, but it's the regulatory state, because those regulations, that's what the regulatory state is what leads to the cronyism, it's what leads to the corruption, and to use Mansur Olson's terminology, it leads to the decline of nations. So that's a long list. But you, in asking your question, you did a good job of answering it too.
I mean, I think these are the pertinent points that really crystallize it in my mind, and I want to share that with people. Have you bring it forward even more?
Yeah. And I think we're out of time, but I'm going to let Brian decide.
Yeah, so we are out of time. So thank you very much, everyone. So maybe we can give Professor Holcombe. We are going to start the next segment about 10 to 15 minutes due to time constraints. So we just have one last segment for today's program. So just a few more couple speeches on the future of developing countries. So that's where we have some people from China and India sharing their experiences of how they're trying to have policies to reform poor countries and developing countries. So without further ado, we